Oof, that is quite warm. So I have here the 2022 MacBook Air with the new M2 chip, which I've been using for about a month now, and I wanted to share some thoughts. Now, the M2 MacBook Air brings a lot of new features to the table, like its brand new design and bigger display. But there have been some talks about some of its shortcomings this year, mainly that this current fanless design isn't quite enough to cope with the heat from the M2 chip, and also that the single NAND chip on the 256GB storage model is performing worse than the 512GB SSD variants. I've been lucky enough to have access to both the base model MacBook Air with an 8-core GPU and 256GB of storage, and the upgraded configuration with a 10-core GPU and 512GB of storage. So I wanted to use them both in everyday life scenarios to see how they function, and also whether the shortcomings I mentioned earlier are noticeable day to day. Alright, so this MacBook Air has had a complete redesign. It's got a brand new body, some new speakers, a new display, and some new colors. You have your silver and space grey, which I'm sure most people would be quite familiar with, the new starlight, and this new midnight color. I've seen some people call this midnight color a matte black, and the color does change a bit depending on your lighting, but for the most part, I'd say it comes off more as a really dark blue. This new color looks great and it's sleek, but for me personally, I'd probably opt for the silver option because the midnight is a massive fingerprint magnet. Also, this is a bit of a nitpick, but because this color is so dark, the ports actually blend in with the body of the MacBook, making them a bit hard to see in a darker room. And there have definitely been a couple of times where I've had to use the phone as a torch because I don't want to fumble around and scratch up the MacBook. Okay, so this new body follows a similar design language to the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros that were released last year. Immediately you'll notice the MacBook Air no longer has its wedge shape. Instead, they've gone with a blockier design. The lid has been flattened out, the edges are rounded off, and underneath, the feet are bigger and flatter, which means they should give you a bit of extra grip. Overall, the body looks a lot chunkier, but it actually comes in thinner and lighter than last generation's model at 0.44 inches and 2.7 pounds. Or 11.3mm and 1.24 kilos, which means the MacBook Air is very light and portable, and it's a fantastic machine to use on the move. It's really a size and weight that's quite comfortable to use anywhere. And another reason it's so great to use is because of the MacBook Air's display. Again, following in the footsteps of the larger MacBook Pros, this year's MacBook Air has some significantly thinner bezels, which means you're getting a bit more screen real estate within the same footprint. So even though this MacBook Air is pretty much the same size as the M1 MacBook Air, you're getting a 13.6-inch display with a resolution of 2560 by 1664, and they've bumped up the brightness to 500 nits. The bigger display is definitely a welcome upgrade. It might seem like a small change, but it actually makes the MacBook a much better productivity machine because you'll be able to see more on your screen, meaning this new display makes working with timelines and spreadsheets that much easier. You'll also be able to multitask better with more active windows you can see at a given time. And as I mentioned earlier, the bigger screen doesn't increase the overall size of the MacBook, meaning it doesn't compromise the portability of the device. Up top, you do have the notch that houses the new 1080p webcam. It's not the most elegant design, but you don't really notice it in everyday use, unless you're someone who uses a lot of menu bar apps, because it does still interfere with those. If you need an even bigger display, you are able to connect the MacBook Air to an external monitor, but just like the M1 MacBook Airs, this model will only support one external display. Alright, for ports, you do get an extra port this year. On the right, you have a 3.5mm headphone jack that's compatible with high impedance headphones, and on the left, you have two Thunderbolt USB 4 ports and the new Magsafe port. Magsafe is a nice addition for protecting your Mac against accidental trips. And it also frees up an additional Thunderbolt port that you no longer need for charging. Although it would have been nice to have a Thunderbolt port on the right side of your MacBook for some extra flexibility. For a device that's this portable, you're going to be using it in a lot of different places, and I do find myself in situations where cables just aren't that comfortable to be plugged into the left side of the MacBook. Okay, so now you have the option to charge your MacBook Air via the Magsafe port with the included Magsafe 3 cable, or you can go back to using the Thunderbolt ports if you have a USB-C cable. The MacBook Air does support fast charging if you have a power adapter that can output 67 watts or higher, and it is able to fast charge via both the Magsafe 3 port or Thunderbolt ports. According to Apple's website though, if you want to fast charge your MacBook via an external monitor, The external monitor will have to deliver 85 watts of power. Also, just as an added fun fact, because the M2 chip is so power efficient, I was able to charge my MacBook with the 20 watt iPad Air charger while browsing the web and streaming Netflix. Obviously it's a bit slower, but still possible. On a full charge, I'm getting about 8 to 10 hours of use, which is enough to last me a full day before I recharge. Alright, so this MacBook Air runs the new M2 chip. And for the first time, Apple has designed a MacBook body around their new processor. The 2020 M1 MacBook Air recycled an old design from the previous generation MacBook. But this year's MacBook Air is a new design, and Apple has once again decided to go completely fanless. The major benefit of this is that the MacBook Air is completely silent in operation. In truth though, with the way Apple Silicon runs, I don't really ever hear the fans, even on my bigger 16-inch MacBook Pro. So I don't really see the fanless design as being all that beneficial to me. Anyway, with the new design, I was curious to see how it would cope with the M2, keeping in mind that the M2 has a greater power draw at the top end. And having used the MacBook Air, it definitely gets hot, which means its performance is most likely being throttled in order to control the temperature. But that only happens when I'm really pushing it. When I'm doing everyday tasks like replying to emails, looking through PDFs, and streaming videos, the M2 MacBook Air was breezing through them. I never really noticed any performance issues or overheating while doing those things, even when it was for the whole day. It's only when I'm really pushing the MacBook with something like multiple long video exports where I start to see it heat up. But I suspect that most people looking to buy this MacBook Air won't be doing that. Okay, but there is one thing you need to be aware of if you're looking to buy this laptop. And that's the fact that the 256GB SSD storage option only runs a single SSD NAND chip while other models run two. And it does mean that the base model will have slower storage performance. In fact, the Blackmagic disk speed test shows a significant drop in speed. Testing the transfer speed myself, I copied a 56GB project from an external SSD to the MacBook Airs and found that the 512GB model was able to complete the transfer in around 1 minute and 45 seconds, while the 256GB model took a longer 3 minutes and 36 seconds. In terms of memory swapping in the SSDs, the SSD with a single NAND chip performed surprisingly well. To test this, I loaded the MacBook Air with a bunch of Chrome tabs to trigger memory swapping, and I was surprised to see that the base model MacBook Air still ran quite smooth. In fact, I was even able to scrub through and edit a 4K timeline in DaVinci Resolve, which was quite surprising. Alright, so what does this all mean? For those looking for the best performance out of their M2 chip, the current 13-inch MacBook Pros is probably where you want to be looking, because its fan will help prevent thermal throttling. But I'm not sure getting a MacBook with an older design is worth it for a performance boost that you probably won't notice too often. This new M2 MacBook Air is a sleek, light, and portable laptop with quality of life improvements like a Magsafe port, fast charging, better camera, and bigger display. Yeah, you're not getting the best performance you can out of the M2 processor, but I think most people looking to buy the M2 MacBook Air can live without that top-end performance. The M2 MacBook Air is still a laptop that looks great, feels great, is portable, and more than capable of running everyday tasks. The same goes for the storage. Even though the 256GB model performs slower, it's still pretty fast storage. Remember, I was testing transfer speeds with a 56GB project, but if you're looking to transfer some work documents or some photos, that difference in transfer speeds between the 256GB option and the 512GB option isn't all that noticeable. With that being said, 256GB of storage really isn't that much on a computer, so I'd still avoid the base model if you can. Alright, those are my thoughts on the M2 MacBook Air. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments if you think the Midnight MacBook Air is worth the fingerprints. Alright, and that's it. I'll see you guys next time.